Well, thank you, Alan. And thank you to all of you for your very warm welcome this morning. Is that sound level okay? Okay, I'm just going to wander around, which is why I look like, well, you said Madonna. I'll take that as a compliment. I took to heart what Councillor, hang on, wait a minute, Miles had said about 1 in 5 children not being ready for school. I noted that there were 600 children in this community out of 18,000 who are of Indigenous or Aboriginal descent. That's 1.8%. I did that quickly. I can still do a mental arithmetic. This is an interesting community, and the Stronger Families Alliance is something that Kate and I have been very aware of and interested in for some years now. It is a shining light in the field of community services, child and family support throughout Australia, and you should be very proud actually of what you've accomplished here in the Blue Mountains. It really is a blueprint for work elsewhere in Australia. And I think a lot of that is down to, well, it's obviously down to the collective work of the community, but also to the dynamism and leadership of Tanya. Now, Tanya, who must be obeyed, set me an assignment for this morning. She gave me a set of headings or instructions as to things I should talk about, which included from criminology to prevention and early intervention, the evolution of the Pathways to Prevention project, the work we're currently doing, all about prevention science, implementation science, data-informed decision making, grounded examples of what we do, etc. And I said, well, can I also talk about climate change and the Big Bang Theory? We might as well cover everything. But thank you, Tanya, for that generous invitation. I don't often get asked to talk about, actually from a semi-personal point of view, why? Well, I think I'll come back to my heading in a minute, but the first question, what's a nice criminologist doing in a place like this? You know, what's the connection? Well, it's going to be pretty obvious that crime and corruption, of which you are really expert in New South Wales. Now, I'm a Sydney-sider by birth, so I know I'm a proud Sydney-sider, and I now live in Queensland, and I think, you know, it'd be an equal contest as to which state has done worse in terms of integrity systems, if you like. Anyway, there is a very close connection between quality of life, quality of communities, what goes on in families, and what kids get up to when they get old enough to get into trouble. And then when they get old enough to get employed in financial institutions and in politics and other places, they can continue sometimes those delinquent activities. So in other words, criminology and crime prevention is all about the nature of the society we live in. It's about what we do, right from the pre-conception period and all that brain development, and we know all of that's relevant. And really, if I had to give myself a label these days, it wouldn't be just criminologist, it would be prevention scientist. And going back to that title, and this was negotiated with Tanya, she approved this. So this has Tanya's tick on it. Using collective impact and prevention science to make children and young people's lives better. Now, there is I'll talk a fair bit about collective impact during this presentation, and one of the points I want to make about it is that it has enormous promise as a movement, but it also has serious pitfalls connected with it. And part of that problem that I see emerging, particularly in this country, is its disconnection from prevention science. I'm going to tell you a bit about what prevention science is and why all of you should be not only reading the literature on brain development, but also reading about the really rigorous research that's emerging about what works in communities, particularly when you're trying to introduce universal community-wide services and interventions. So, you're going to become a little less mystified about why I'm here and talking about this topic as we proceed. And we're going to talk about tackling wicked problems. Now, I'm not going to do this in any particular order, and I'll probably meander from theme to theme, and we won't get through half of it, Tanya. Is that all right? But we'll just have a nice discussion, I hope. And again, emphasising the importance of science, desperately seeking science. We wring our hands and we write a lot of persuasive things about what we're going to do about the really tough problems. But we aren't particularly effective. We know we're not effective in moving forward as a country. And in fact, in many respects, we're going backwards. And I'll show you some evidence for that in a moment. Tanya asked me to talk about the Pathways to Prevention report and the project that we developed by the same name in Brisbane, which ran for 10 years. I'll tell you a bit about that work and its importance as a foundation for our current thinking about how to do the sort of work in communities that you're all so interested in. I've always been very interested, ever since I worked many years ago now with Emeritus Professor Tony Vinson, in the confluence or the bringing together of human and community development. How do we develop outcomes, positive outcomes for individuals, but how do we do that in the context of developing the capacity of the village, the communities in which we live? How do we keep the focus on the macro level as well as on the individual? And how do we get better outcomes, particularly for young people? And one of the things Kate and I have learned through struggle and experience and being biffed periodically is that systems trump programs. It doesn't matter how good your program, if the organisations and systems that you work with, and Tanya showed us some pictures of those, or some diagrams, if the system doesn't work in your favour, or even worse, undermines, even without knowing it, the initiative that you're trying to introduce, then you're going to fail. So we have to understand systems as well as communities. Talked about collective impact, and I particularly want to talk about the model of community practice, which goes by the acronym of CREATE, C-R-E-A-T-E, hence the title, Creating a New Way to Do Community Prevention. We invented this before the collective impact article was published in 2011. You've got a copy of that article in your folder by John Kania and his colleagues. In fact, there's Kate, I tell the story sometimes, Kate came bounding into my room with a copy of that article and said, Ross, these people have just said better what we've been trying to say for years and no one's been listening. So it just proves Homel's third law, that no matter how good an idea any Australian has, there'll be some smart American who's in print before we are. Anyway, there's a great degree of similarity and agreement between the CREATE model that we developed and the whole collective impact movement. And finally, the challenge for the future, and you can see why I'm not going to get through all of this, shaping the future, large-scale, sustainable, contextually sensitive, evidence-based practices that transform the developmental system for children. Now, every word in there actually means something and there's a literature behind it. Particularly that phrase, developmental system. Tanya showed the Bronfenbrenner concentric circle model, or a version of it. One of the great privileges I had was a few months ago to have a whole afternoon discussion with Emeritus Professor Jacqueline Goodnow, probably Australia's most famous developmental psychologist, and she died 2 months ago at the age of 89, and I'm going to treasure the memory of that afternoon in her lounge room with the picture window looking over the harbour from her beautiful home. And one of the things she said was that she'd wished Bronfenbrenner had never drawn those bloody diagrams, because she said it's much more complicated than that, and things don't work actually in those concentric circles that everybody reproduces at every conference I've ever been to. But now I don't want to be negative, but I think we need to draw on the deeper wisdom now that's coming out of the developmental literature and the prevention science literature. And so that's really the focus of what I want to talk about. And as a preliminary to that, I said not everything's getting better. Now, 2 weeks ago, there was probably the best Institute of Family Studies conference in Melbourne that I've ever been to. It was a marvellous conference. One of the keynotes was Emeritus Professor Dorothy Scott, who will be very well known to many of you. Just look at those figures. I think Councillor Miles said that by age 5, 1 in 5 children won't be ready for school. Well, these are the figures on child protection, and I had trouble believing this when I heard her say this and read her slides. By age 18, 1 in 4.2 children in Queensland and 1 in 3 in New South Wales are going to be known to the child protection system. Just think about the implications of that. Now, that doesn't mean that all those children, their families have been investigated, that they've been put in care. It just means that somebody at some point made some kind of notification that's gotten into the system. And that in itself is a very disturbing statistic. And 1 in 1.6 children, Aboriginal children nationally, known to the child protection system. My colleagues and I at Griffith working on a very large federally funded project in some communities in North Queensland to reduce the rates of child sexual abuse. There's one community, and I'm not going to name it, where every child up to the age of 12 has been raped at least once. Every child, and often the other offender is another child or an older child. This is part of the fabric of the communities that we're currently living in Australia. Not the Blue Mountains, I might hasten to add. This is a fairly privileged community in comparison with many of the communities that would give rise to these figures and many of the communities that we've been working in Queensland. And that's the growth in the statistics. And as Dorothy said 2 weeks ago, this is unsustainable. So what that means, I think, is that actually as a country, we have to take primary prevention seriously. That is, we can no longer rely on a tertiary system that is not coping now, let alone with that endless increase, although it's tapering off a bit, I notice, in the last couple of years. It's probably just system overload. Anyway, that's very depressing. I just want to say there is hope. There is a lot of hope that we can do better than this, but it will mean the sorts of things that Tanya has just been talking about, which is actually doing all of the redesign of the service system for families and children to prevent this kind of inexorable growth in the tertiary system. We've really got to divert resources from one to the other. And, well, one of the many statistics that I remember from the recent federal budget is that now 0.1% of the health budget is being devoted to preventative health. I mean, that probably says more about the priorities of this country in terms of primary prevention than anything else I could say. So, for Kate and I, the bottom line, and our other colleagues at Griffith, and there's a whole team of people who've worked on this over the years, I don't have time to mention them all, but the bottom line for us is better measured outcomes for children. So that's the focus of our work. And I say measured quite advisedly, since if we can't actually measure an improvement, then what we've done won't necessarily be a persuasive argument for government or for even the communities we work in. We ought to apply the same standards of evidence in the fields we work in as we would expect if we were going into a GP's office, or more particularly into a specialist's office who's going to do something to us for our health. We'd expect that specialist to actually draw on the best available research on drugs and surgery and all the rest of it that actually make a real difference. We don't want to rely on guesswork and experience. We want to rely, well, we need the experience, but we also need the science behind it. We're particularly interested in better outcomes for children living in disadvantaged communities. Now, this is out of context, but it's actually the most important thing I want to talk about, which is our CREATE model. So I thought I'd better put it up at the beginning without any preparation, adequate preparation, and I'll come back to this later on. But let me just run through it very briefly so you've got some idea of what we're talking about. So at the top there we have the overall goal, better lives for children in disadvantaged communities. And in fact, in this context this morning, I would say what we're talking about with collective impact and this CREATE model is actually better outcomes for all children in all communities. And there is a problem, of course, with place-based approaches that if you're particularly focusing on disadvantaged communities, we know that about half the disadvantaged kids in Australia don't actually live in disadvantaged communities or communities labelled as disadvantaged. And so there is much need everywhere. That's the point I'm making. So this is a general model which we believe is applicable potentially in nearly every community throughout Australia. So the first, the C stands for collaborative. Now we talk a lot about collaboration, in this country. Everybody thinks they're doing collaboration. Our experience is that it almost never happens in practice when you actually apply a rigorous definition of what collaboration involves. So one of our key goals through our model is to recognise that development is multifaceted in the way that Tanya drew attention to. So collaboration demands that system silos be transcended through a comprehensive and integrated approach based on good governance. Governance is really important because it's more than about, I think the word you used was how you operate. It's actually about accountability, it's about transparency, and it's about the ethical use of power in complicated partnerships where can be a lot of friction, a lot of conflict. So I'm getting negative this morning. I'm getting old and crabby. You know, I don't like to emphasise the negative, but we have to be aware of the dangers, the risks. That actually, I'm sure you're all very familiar with some of those concepts of governance and the potential for conflict. Now, everything's based on relationships. I've had to learn this myself over the years. People like Kate are much more instinctively in tune with this. And the people that we work with in communities, like Cherie Lamb, the manager of our Pathways team for years, she always came back to this, the importance of relationships. You can't do anything in communities unless people have your trust, and unless you engage respectfully over time with all the key organisations and players. That takes a lot of time, and this work is not done overnight. I talked about that very challenging program I'm doing with colleagues, particularly Stephen Smallbone up in North Queensland, where we had somebody from the Prime Minister's Department come up to us 3 weeks ago for our roundtable planning meeting. And he said, look, if you don't have something on the ground in the next few weeks and something I can show the Prime Minister that you're doing with some indication of success, we're going to cut your funding. Thanks very much. That was a really positive, uplifting message, and I'm glad you think the problem is so easily solved. And yes, Minister, we'll do that. But that is just so... as he was talking, I mean, he was embarrassed to say it, but as he was talking, I was thinking, how typical that the political always trumps everything else. And we know how hard this work is and how long it takes to build relationships of trust, but there's a deeper theoretical point here. We talk about developmental systems. That means the whole fabric, there's systems of relations and connections between organisations and levels of organisation in a community. So it's not just the service system. At the centre of all communities are what I call the enduring developmental institutions of family and school, and often religious organisations as well, which are often neglected in terms of the integration of the way we work with resources and services in communities. So relationships are fundamental. So that's the R. And Tanya, thank you very much. Not only early in life, but early in the pathway. The first 3 years of life is critical, but so is the rest of your life, including when you're 65, which is, yes, really, that's how old I am. And I think you grow and develop and change and you face challenges at every point in your life. And I think my brain is still changing, not only for the worse, mostly for the worse, but I can do things now that I couldn't do when I was 20, much better. And I won't go into detail. There are some things I don't do as well. A for accountable, I've already talked about that, with good governance, so transparency, ethics, and particularly actually committing to shared goals. That's one of the core principles of collective impact, one of the 4 or 5 conditions of collective impact. Shared vision or goals, but they've got to be measurable. And we also have to be mature enough as a service sector and as a political system to acknowledge that we're not always going to actually improve those measured outcomes, at least not in the first 5 minutes. So it takes time, but at least we need to know whether we're getting toward our goal for children or for families. Now, T is not the best letter here, but we needed T. But it does refer to a very important word, which is training. We'd probably prefer to use empowerment, but that gives us too many E's. But it's about empowerment of the human services workforce, but also, equally important for our work, the empowerment of school teachers and other people and parents, the people who work with kids every day and often have to solve problems on the run. I've got 4 kids, believe me, and they're all different. And they've all posed challenges. And I'm sure you have similar experiences. We all need help. Families can't do it all, schools can't do it all. So it's about actually the resources that we bring to bear to empower the people who make the environment for children actually work. That's the key there. And finally, evidence-based. Now, we actually have a more sophisticated version of that concept of evidence-based than you might think we do. But nevertheless, it's important that what we do, as far as possible, be grounded in evidence of its likely effectiveness. So look, that's really, I could probably sit down now because that's the most important thing I wanted to talk about. But I'll tell you a bit about what we're doing with this model and really exciting work, but also where did this come from and how did it develop? It's all about developing a stronger developmental system for children. So it's that fabric, the conditions which make human beings human. That's what we're all trying to strengthen in our respective ways in our work. So many of you are very familiar with the Preschool program. This is a program that began in a very poor industrialised area of Michigan back in 1962. Where are we? Actually, this fellow, David Weichert, was appointed as a school system administrator in Ypsilanti, Michigan in the late 1950s, and he was shocked to discover that a very large number of African-American children, 3- and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, when they got to school, were doing really, really badly. And he decided to invent a new kind of school, a preschool. This was a revolutionary concept, particularly in the US back in the early 60s. And they were going to try and boost the IQ of poor kids so that they could have a better life and do better at school. And this has been an extraordinarily influential lighthouse, or beacon of hope, if you like, in the years since it was implemented. Just with approximately 130 children, half of whom were assigned at random to a control group who got nothing, and the other half of whom got an enriched preschool environment with a focus on independent learning and supported by a home visit once a week from the teacher to the mother, usually a single mother who was raising the 3- or 4-year-old at home. And that's the outcomes for the kids at age 40. So these kids have been followed up most of their life. Now this is just one fragment, but you'll see that of the kids who benefited from that enriched preschool program and the home visit, 36% had been arrested 5 times or more, which is a very important statistic for a criminologist because this is persistent, serious criminal activity, compared with 55% of the control group. Now, there's actually 2 ways of looking at that. I'm shocked that 36% even of that intervention group are still getting into such serious trouble and almost certainly would have spent much of their life in prison. So this is not an absolute solution to any problem. I'm just making the point. This is where a lot of the work in early intervention and prevention started, and this has continued to be the inspiration for many, many people throughout the world, this evidence of long-term effectiveness in very unexpected ways. This project has had outcomes which were not even imagined originally by David Weichert. So it's an extraordinary program and an extraordinary set of outcomes. They're much more likely to own their own home, well actually to some extent more likely to own their home, more likely to be employed, they pay more tax. This is the kids who got the benefit of the program. They have more stable lives and better marriages on the whole, you know. So basically, on the whole, they had better lives. And the cost-benefit analysis, and there's been a lot of work done by Heckman. I've had some personal discussions with him about all of this work, the economist. But look where the savings are. Now, why is a criminologist interested in this? Well, this is one piece of evidence. Overwhelmingly, these early intervention prevention programs have most of their benefits in terms of the savings to the community, in terms of reductions in crime and the impact on crime victims. And this is something that really does interest me. Very little of the benefit relatively is in education outcomes, although they are important, or in the terms of taxes and reductions in welfare demands. It's primarily in the savings from avoiding the criminal justice system and the costs to victims. And so I've always taken the view for many years that this approach to prevention should be foundational to the work I do, and I wish more of my colleagues in this country could get interested in this. Now, in recent years, and I won't go through this in any detail, we're probably running out of time, and I'm only about 1/10 of my way through my presentation.
We'll give you your Q&A.
Right. Matt Manning's one of my PhD graduates. He's an economist. He's worked on the economics of early prevention, and we've looked at a whole range of different kinds of early prevention programs, nearly all implemented in the US. Structured preschool, which the Perry preschool program would have been a precursor. Centre-based childcare and developmental daycare, which there's a lot of controversy about, of course, in this country at the moment, and how we fund that. Home visitation, like David Oll's program. Family support services, very, very important. And parent education, Triple P, but a whole range of other initiatives as well. And so on and so on. These are what I call the famous brand name programs. These are the lighthouse or blueprints programs that we still so often refer to. Well, we analysed the outcomes over time into the adolescent years of all of these early in life interventions, looking at rigorous evaluations. So we looked in terms of educational success, cognitive development, social and emotional development, deviance, drug use and so on, social participation, involvement in the criminal justice system and indicators of family well-being. Now that's the graph of effect sizes. All it means is it's a way of summarising in a standardised form the magnitude of the impact across those 6 domains, or 7, or however many there are. So the biggest impact overall was in terms of educational success, ES, but deviance was number 2. So this is adolescent drug use, antisocial behaviour and so on. Again, we see the power of these early in life rigorous evidence-based programs for long-term impacts on often very disadvantaged populations. But we also have evidence, which I'll show you later on, that you can get similar and even better results sometimes in less disadvantaged settings. So this is win-win-win. If we do more of this sort of thing, everybody's going to benefit. I won't go through the other results in detail, but they're all positive. So, as I say here by way of summary, the Perry preschool experiment has inspired innumerable early prevention policies and initiatives. When I was in the UK about 10 years ago, in the early days of Sure Start, I spoke to Naomi Eisenstadt, the New Yorker who was heading up the British developments there in early intervention, and she said, "Ross, this is just Perry preschool writ large." You know, this program's had an enormous influence. But also, as I've demonstrated, other carefully designed projects or proof of concept initiatives, as Jack Shonkoff calls them, have achieved similar results. But these brand name programs on their own are not going to get us there. We're not going to solve all the problems of the Blue Mountains or of anywhere else by just expanding the list of famous programs that we implement here. We're going to have to do more of that system level development that I referred to. Now, our own history of work, and Kate's been with this project since 2001, so she's as much a part of this work as I am. We produced a report back in 1999 called Pathways to Prevention, and That has led, via the project that we established of the same name, to a longitudinal database that we're currently analysing. This is really important because somebody, I think it was you, Chris, last night said, well, we really know family support works in terms of better outcomes for families and children. Well, actually, as a scientist, no, we don't. There's almost no evidence anywhere in the world that family support makes any difference to anybody, parent or child. When I say no evidence, we have plenty of practice wisdom, which I actually think is pretty right, pretty correct. But what we don't have are the randomised controlled trials. We don't have the kind of evidence that would be taken for granted in the health field, even the preventative health or the mental health field. We have not translated that kind of thinking to the industry we're engaged in, and that is one of the huge challenges, because we're going to all get machine gunned down by crazy politicians. I promised I wouldn't say anything rude about politicians. So our whole focus is on strengthening the developmental system in all our work. So we're analysing our database to actually address the question, what effect does family support have on outcomes for children? And we're getting some very encouraging results, although not necessarily exactly what you'd expect. And more relevant to this presentation today, we've come up with this model, CREATE, came out of our frustrations in trying to actually change systems as part of our pathways work, and we realised we needed a new way of working. So it grew out of our failure, if you like, to achieve all the goals we'd set for ourselves. So they're the two huge activities we're currently engaged in, funded by the Australian Research Council and a whole range of other partners. That's the original Pathways to Prevention report, which is still available on the web, on the federal government's website. If you Google on it, you should be able to download it as a PDF. It's still, in my view, a huge repository of wisdom on how we should proceed in this field. I was only one of the authors. In fact, as I said in her recent obituary, Jacqueline Goodno's fingerprints are on every single one of the 400 pages. It's a testimony to one of the greatest developmental psychologists this country's ever produced. So how did I get interested in this? Well, I had a colleague at Cambridge University, David Farrington, who kept sending me reprints of all his articles, and I thought initially it was a way of humiliating me because he publishes about 20 articles for every one that I publish. He's famous. His CV's like a telephone book. That's not his articles, that's just his CV. Anyway, he was sending me these articles, including on the effects of early prevention, early intervention. And I scratched my head and thought, well, what are we doing in Australia about this? And in the mid-1990s, it turns out not much. We were doing a bit in areas like disabilities and mental health in terms of early intervention, but we really had no national policies. We talked about early prevention, early intervention. And so we published this report, brought a lot of research together. The vision behind the report was to lay the scientific foundations for doing this work better, for sustainable improvements in well-being. And we needed to know what worked in what I describe here as uncontrolled, messy community situations, not the laboratories or the carefully designed university experiments that I listed earlier, but actually real communities where you can't control everything and you walk into the school and there's kids being suspended in front of your eyes and people are yelling at each other and, well, I don't want to get too colourful about it, but I've sometimes wondered how our education system keeps going on and how teachers and principals turn up for work every day, given the challenges they often face in our primary schools. Now, as I said before, we were interested in promoting both community and human development, so not just about individuals. And we needed stuff that was based on evidence and wasn't just tied to those specific programs or commercial franchises. You know, you don't want to have to pay out lots of money for your training and your licensing every year to do everything that you do in this area, and that's one of the disadvantages of these famous programs, or some of them. And so we reviewed a lot of literature and did an audit of existing social and health services in Australia, and formulated a policy framework and so on and so on. None of this was properly followed through by the federal government, though, even though the report had a huge impact. As Alan Hayes says, the report was a landmark in terms of Australian thinking on early intervention and prevention, and really has had a big influence. But to the extent that it's now part of the policy agenda, although I think it's somewhat threatened at the moment. Anyway, we started the Pathways project in Brisbane because the federal government wouldn't fund us for the second stage of this work because they had their favourite people that they that they gave a lot of money to. So I went and worked with a private foundation, the John Barnes Foundation, and got a lot of support from Queensland Department of Education and the Health Department, and we started the project. And well, we had a whole range of goals. I'm not going to go through much of this in any detail, but it was a universal early intervention approach. Did focus initially on the transition to school and then promoting positive pathways through primary school. In the most disadvantaged urban area in Queensland, involved the integration of family support programs with a whole lot of preschool and school-based programs across 7 schools in the region. And we did try as far as possible to work within that community development framework. And that was our focus, to really bridge the huge gaps between community services, schools and families and children. Now that's particularly the case in disadvantaged communities, but I think it's a problem everywhere. And the whole focus, of course, was ultimately to build community capacity. And we did build on this developmental systems concept, and in particular we were aware that actions in one setting, like schools, need to interact with and support and complement actions in other settings like the home. So that what's going on in the 2 settings for children should interlock and should mutually reinforce each other. And the focus of our work was to try and build those mutually reinforcing system relationships. Sounds easy to say, it's very hard to do. Really hard, really hard in practice. And that's the history. You know, I'm going to give you some copies of these slides. You can look at the history in more detail. We had a whole major phase that Kate designed when I was in hospital called Linking to Learn and Learning to Link, which was a huge effort to build those bridges, particularly between families and schools and the helping agencies in the community. And there it is. And we published a report that's also available on the web should anybody want to draw it down. And I've got some hard copies that I can even send you still, where we summarised results over the first 5 years of the Pathways work. And as I said earlier, we put the pieces together, and Kate's going to talk a bit about this in your workshop or panel later on. It's all loaded, all our data is loaded into a secure longitudinal database, and we've got records on about 6,000 children from 3,860 families, so about 1/3 of whom were involved in our Pathways work, and we draw on the rest of those children and families as control families. And that's just one example of an as yet unpublished result from our analysis of the effects of family support on children, in this case their behaviour in school as rated by the teacher. Essentially what this graph shows is quite a complicated graph, but it shows that for those who had relatively low levels of contact with the Pathways program, perhaps only 6 or 10 sessions or support meetings or whatever it might have been, and for those parents who initially had a very low rate of low level of empowerment, that's what PEM stands for. It's Parent Empowerment and Efficacy Measure. It's a validated measure that we've developed as part of our work. So for parents or families where the parents initially had very low levels of empowerment and where the program actually improved their levels of empowerment substantially, and those families who had relatively low levels or brief contact with Pathways, there was a huge reduction in, there was a big improvement in, for those children and those families, a big improvement in their behaviour as rated by the teachers. That's just one result from a series of analyses that are about to be published. Now that's really encouraging because it means that we don't have to spend $1 million in every family. Now, actually it's more complicated than that, and I don't really have time to unpack this. But I just wanted to show you this as an illustration of the kinds of analyses that we're doing and that we're going to publish in a series of papers over the next 2 or 3 years. to try and make a contribution to putting family support and this community work onto a more secure scientific foundation, and perhaps to challenge some of the thinking about how long we need to work with families. On the other hand, we need to think more carefully about the levels of adversity that some of these high contact families were facing. So I'm not saying anything terribly definite about these results, just that this is an example of what we're doing. Now I'm going to skip all of this. This was our failure. Well, it was actually a success and a failure. As part of our work some years ago, we set up a program called Circles of Care, which was really designed to strengthen the developmental system. And with that purpose in mind, it actually didn't succeed, but we learned a lot about what we should have done in the process. And I won't have time to go through this, so I'm just going to skip all of this. Happy to talk about it in the workshop. Why we failed, where we succeeded, and what we learned. And I think failure is actually more instructive than success. You get very smug and set in your ways when everything works the way you think it should. It's when it doesn't work, you have to really sit down and, you know, a bit battered and bruised. That's when you have to think. You know, it's really hard to think. Anyway, so as I said, I'm going to skip all of that. And I've already introduced Create. You can see why I started with it, because I knew I wouldn't get to it properly if I didn't start with it. But this Create model, which we're currently developing capacity to do in partnership with a number of organisations. It's later on. I'll come back to this. We're working with the Federal Department of Social Services through the Communities for Children program. That's our vehicle, if you like, or our what we call the delivery system for services to children throughout 52 communities in Australia. And we're also working with state government departments in New South Wales and in Queensland, and with 5 non-government agencies, including 3 very large national organisations, Mission Australia, Smith Family and the Benevolent Society. And in the next stage, which will begin in 2016, we'll be taking all of those, capacity resources that I'll describe in a moment, actually the instruments and tools and systems that you need to do collective impact. We'll be taking all of that, we will be taking all of that into a second implementation stage in partnership with the federal government in a larger number of communities. We're only working in 10 communities at the moment in 2 states. We'll be looking at a larger number across the whole of Australia. So the goal is to build and test a set of structured processes and resources, and those words really do mean something. Structured processes. We're going to be employing human beings in 3 communities, which we're calling collaboration managers or collaboration facilitators, to work with local partnerships to move the partnerships from usually a model of coordination to one of full collaboration around shared goals and all the stuff that everyone's now familiar with from the collective impact rubric. So what we're effectively doing is building a prevention support system which will support the delivery system, which is constituted by this program, Communities for Children. Communities for Children is a great delivery system. It's a good way of creating partnerships of service providers in communities, but federal government's done absolutely nothing to build a proper support system. In the first evaluation of this program, there was actually nothing at all measured. Not a single thing was measured. And they had to use national surveys and so on to actually come up with an evaluation. So we're building, in partnership with all of these organisations, a support system which does have the long-term goal of doing all the stuff I talked about before. Transforming the environments in which children grow up is therefore sustainable, is effective in all communities, particularly highly disadvantaged communities. It's genuinely collaborative, incorporates elements that are supported by evidence, and achieves measurable or quantitative improvements, short and long term, in the well-being of children and young people, and is cost effective. We have our economist colleague working on all of the economic analysis. Now, yes, that really is achievable. We're on the cusp in this country and internationally of knowing how to do this. The greatest problem is political. And we've got to get the message to the Prime Minister and his ministers. Now, the Minister for Social Services, Kevin Andrews, he's got this in his head. If you read his speeches, he talks all the time about strengthening families and communities, measurable outcomes, evidence-based practice, and early intervention and prevention. And so, whether he knows it or not, he's an advocate of prevention science, and that's the missing ingredient. In the community services sector and amongst what I call the social entrepreneurs, there's great interest in collective impact. There's a tidal wave of interest in collective impact, but what it misses is any even acknowledgement that unless we draw on the fundamental research that's been done about how to strengthen systems and how to translate what works from the small scale to the large scale, we're going to fail. If this isn't adopted with a public health perspective or a population health perspective, and we don't take seriously doing the hard yards in terms of building measures and evidence and making mistakes and doing this it's going to take a long time. But actually to do it systematically and scientifically, we're all just going to fail, and we are not going to change those statistics on child protection that I showed you earlier, unless we actually build painstakingly, drawing on every bit of evidence that we can. And when I put this argument to a group at the Centre for Social Innovation in Sydney a couple of months ago, I said, we're not drawing on the research and the bench science, if you like. And they all said, you don't know what you're talking about. A fellow got up and said, I totally disagree with you, Ross Homel. I've had the former Treasurer of Australia, Wayne Swan, stand up at a public event like this when I made these comments and said, I disagree. The federal government, under my government, measured everything. Well, no, they didn't. And they didn't draw on this evidence. I'm sorry, the previous Labor government failed, I think, in this particular area to build those support systems that we're currently working on. So we're building that support system, which is underpinned also by a translation system, and I don't have time, you can get the handout later, to support this delivery system. Those are all of our partners, including Brian Brumberger and Mark Greenberg at Penn State. They're the NGOs and the government departments that are currently working with us. There could have been more organisations joining up with us, but basically I ran out of time. Actually, there's about 1 minute left.
We're extending.
No. I'm going to stop in a minute. Actually, it's been a really good project so far, and it's only officially started a month ago, but I'm getting on a bit now in my career as a researcher. It's new in my experience to have government departments come to me and say, why didn't you include us in this project? We've got cash, can we join? And that's been our experience. And so the project's actually become bigger as we've proceeded. I think that just shows the hunger for this sort of work and this sort of capacity building. So I'm going to, this is important. So I've got an extra couple of minutes. I'm going to finish off just by describing these resources that we're developing and how we're going to proceed, and then I'll stop. Okay, an interactive web-based set of resources. Now this is Kate's vision. She did a master's on the use of technology and media in developing services for children. Is that a complete travesty of what you did? Yeah, more or less. But anyway, she's very interested, and she's the project scientist who's working on this. We're developing training tools for teachers and community workers, videos. We've already developed a lot of video games for families and children. We have an interactive computer game that measures the social and emotional well-being of children. We've validated that on 4,000 children from different socioeconomic classes. So it's a valid measure of the well-being of primary age children. That's the bottom line. We're currently throwing that tool into the mix here, and that program or that measure will be redeveloped so that it's iPhone, or more particularly, who's got an iPad? It'll be working on your iPad in 12 months' time. Okay? And it will be supported by a lot of training tools. So what is social and emotional well-being and protective factors for children? Why would you bother to measure them? How does it fit with the AEDI? Why is it better than the AEDI? We're nothing if not modest. How do you use it, and more particularly, what do you do with it when you've got a measure? You can have a measure at the individual level, the classroom level, at the whole of school level, or at the whole of community level, or at the whole of nation level. This is a tool that's usable at multiple levels. When we developed this tool initially, it had the name Clowning Around, and that's because the central cartoon character at the moment is a clown. I've got some pictures on this, but I'm not going to show you because I'll just keep talking, and that would not be a good thing. And when we developed this in partnership with Mission Australia and Education Queensland, we took the tool when it was finished to Education Queensland and had a meeting with them and said, well, look, you're co-owners of this, you've got a perpetual unlimited licence to use it, how do you want to use it? And they said, oh dear, we don't want to use this because if we did, we might find out things we don't want to know, and we don't have the programs to support the children that we might identify as in having particular needs. You know, I shouldn't be surprised at these reactions. But anyway, things have changed and they're really keen to use it now. But more particularly, as I said, we're developing resources that will actually, that communities can draw on to do something about the measurements that they've come up with for children. Yes, now data sharing management systems. Did we talk about governance and transparency? Well, now Seri Rankin and her colleagues with the 1020 Foundation are using, or maybe using, ETO, effort to outcome, very good set of software. I think we should all just buy it, but we're not going to do that because governments already have their own data systems, don't they? So the good ship DSS is going to plough on regardless. The federal government's going to, this is all being recorded, isn't it? They're going to spend wisely a very large amount of money to develop their own data system, I think. But maybe they can be persuaded to use software that other community organisations want to use. Anyway, this issue of data sharing in local partnerships, local collaborations is a really, really big thing. And how we do that is going to take a lot of effort and discussion and probably a lot of conflict over the next year or two. And I mentioned these collaboration managers. Essentially, they're going to support the community partnerships in implementing the CREATE model and achieving the core conditions of collective impact. And they're employed under our grant. They're independent of federal government, state government, or any service delivery organisation. That's really important. So in a sense, they're part of what you'd call a backbone support system in the collective impact framework. So there it is. You've got a copy of that. They're the 5 conditions of collective impact. Can you close your eyes and recite them? Common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, and continuous communication supported by a backbone system. Right. And as I said earlier, there's a tidal wave of interest in collaboration and collective impact. And like all tidal waves, you could get very wet and very dumped by the wave if you're not careful, unless you can introduce the science as the foundation of it. Skip all of that. I think that's a really important point. And that's really why we're doing this project. It's wonderful to have collective impact. It's wonderful to have these programs. But we've got to give people the opposable thumbs. People in communities have to know how to do this work. And they have to have the tools to do it. And that's really hard work, and it takes a lot of effort collaboratively to achieve. And that's a schematic of some of the things we're doing. I've talked about some of them already. The PEM measure of parental empowerment, which is now publicly available. We've published an article that shows its validity and reliability. Measuring the well-being of children and with this computer game, which our provisional working title for the new version is called Creature Quest. We're getting rid of the clown Doesn't work very well in remote Aboriginal communities and other places. But that's only a provisional title. We're working with a multimedia company in Brisbane to develop the animation and the technology and the concepts underpinning this. A lot of data management technology is going to go into this support system, and also a lot on how to collaborate, how to work together happily, a lot of resources for families and children, support for community action plans, and a lot of support for the collection and use of data. And Kate, are you going to talk about any of this later on? Briefly, yeah, in your workshops and panel. That's, I think, the best summary of the challenges of collaboration. I've been to a few meetings like that. Or another way of summarising it. So we have some serious challenges in this area. I love this quote that our colleague Sarah Branch gave us in the History of Service Integration. One is struck by the nobility of intent with respect to collaboration, its tenacity of purpose and its ineffectiveness in implementation. Co-location is not enough. Community hubs in schools, great idea, but on their own they're not going to achieve any collaboration. You need a clear outcomes focus, shared vision, goals. Structural barriers and mindsets need to be tackled. We need deliberate strategies, as Tanya said, to link systems, and we need to use data to do all of that. And it's the power of data that's going to actually make this happen. And these collaboration managers are going to motivate, lead by example. We took this off the web, but I changed, oh, that got my font changed. It's your fault. That was actually in a nice font that was all fractured. Yeah, I'm stopping. They're going to resolve conflict, create teamwork, and do all these marvellous things with the existing partnerships and communities. And we're going to learn a lot about how their work goes over the next couple of years. And so that's part of developing the systems for collective impact or for collaboration, which we hope will be all incorporated into that prevention support system that we're developing, and that I hope will be available eventually to all communities throughout Australia. It won't be just communities for children, but we'll have to get the agreement of our partners. And I'm just going to stop at that point. Thank you very much.